Arizona Science is supported by Research Corporation for Science Advancement.
For Arizona Public Media, I'm Tim Swindle, Professor Emeritus of Planetary Science at the University of Arizona, and this is Arizona Science. Joining me today is Don Swann, a biologist with Saguaro National Park. Welcome, Don.
It's great to be here.
Don, since saguaros are the symbol of the Sonoran Desert and the namesake of the national park, I think the question most people would have is, how are the saguaros doing?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, fortunately, we have some insight into that because we've been monitoring saguaros at Saguaro National Park really since the early 1940s. The saguaros were actually in decline for a long period of time. We weren't seeing establishment or recruitment of new saguaros from the early 1900s through the 1960s. And so the Park Service and scientists and people in Tucson were alarmed by that. And in the 1960s, little saguaros started appearing for the first time in decades, and we saw really a large number coming into the population in the 60s and 70s, and then really surging in the 1980s. So those saguaros, which range between 40 and 70 years old, are starting to reach reproductive age now, and so in many ways the saguaro population is very healthy. There's been a lower amount of recruitment since the 1990s, since about the late 1990s, which has coincided with the long-term drought that we're in. We're keeping an eye on that.
Do we know why the recruitment changes from decade to decade?
One of the interesting things about Saguaro National Monument and the cactus forest in the 1930s was, if you look at the photographs, the magnificent saguaros, it's just a beautiful stand of saguaros, but very few trees. Scientists from the University of Arizona, Ray Turner and others, eventually realized that those trees are really critical to the success and the survival of the seedlings when they're young. Saguaro doesn't reach an inch tall until it's 6 to 8 years old, and they have to be a certain size before they can store enough water to get through the dry periods. And so the trees will protect them from the heat in the summer, from the cold in the winter, and they provide additional soil moisture. And so those trees were cut down for both industrial and domestic use in the early years in the 1900s. When the park was established, the trees began to be protected, and they came back. And after a few decades, the young saguaros began to come back as well.
What does it take to have a good year for establishment?
The sweet spot seems to be kind of a series of cooler, wetter years that will ensure enough moisture in the soil for those seedlings to be able to survive the dry periods until they're old enough when they can store water and survive a deeper drought.
With the climate getting a little bit warmer, is that going to change what the range of the saguaros is?
So one of the questions that we get a lot is, will saguaros start to move upslope in Saguaro National Park? If you go all the way up to the top of the Rincon Mountains, it's mixed conifer forest, and saguaros don't go all the way up there. So we looked into this a few years ago. We did a paper with Adam Springer and Michael Crimmins from here at the U of A, looking at that very question, whether they're moving upslope. We didn't find any evidence that they are. What we found instead was that wildfire, which is typically common in the forest but not common in the desert, fire is moving downslope. And so those fires coming down into saguaro habitat are killing saguaros at the upper elevations of their range. So the way that saguaros respond to climate is complex, and we're still kind of learning about that.
How about the way that saguaros interact with the wildlife? As wildlife populations change, can you see any difference in saguaro populations?
No, we don't. I don't really have a lot of knowledge about kind of specific population level responses, but one thing that we do know is that saguaros are what we consider to be a keystone species. They provide habitat, they provide food through nectar and fruit for a large number of animals. Members of the Tanoatum tribe harvest saguaro fruit every year in the park, as they have for centuries. It's a very important part of their culture. So this is a really just an incredibly important and amazing plant that we're fortunate enough to be able to celebrate and study in the park.
And I suppose we should say, how long does a typical long-lived saguaro live?
I always say, ask me in 100 years, but probably around 150 to 200 years. They don't start to reproduce until they're 60 or 75 years old in this area. This is a really intriguing plant that has a different lifestyle than we do and that we can learn a lot from.
Well, thanks a lot for coming in, Don.
You're welcome. It's been a pleasure. Thanks.
Our guest today has been Don Swann, a biologist with the Saguaro National Park. This is Tim Swindle, and you have been listening to Arizona Science. You can also listen to this and other Arizona Science segments by going to the AZPM website at azpm.org.
Thank you to Research Corporation for Science Advancement for their support of Arizona Science.